This presentation will talk about updating a vendor on selected products. It's going to be using Ruby on Rails with Ajax, and the point is to show how to update multiple items using Ajax. And here's how you do it. You can update a couple items. In this case, I updated those three. There used to be Velveta. Click Update Vendor on Selected Products. It'll pop up a modem. You can now choose one of the vendors to select. Let's pick Niklu, update vendor, and now those three items are now Niklu. That's all there is to it. I didn't refresh the whole page. I didn't refresh the whole table. I just refreshed those three items after updating the database. And this presentation will show you how to do that. This is the HTML code in index.html.erb. For this presentation, the important parts are this button with a class of UPD_vendors. That's going to be used to start the process. Line 30 is where the partial _index.html.erb is rendered. This is going to be the table of products. And line 34 has got the area where the Bootstrap modal will be generated by this program. So the modal will be tucked into this div called product modal. This is the HTML for the partial that generates the product table in _index.html.erb. Line 15 generates the checkbox. It has a class of CBXRow and a value of the product ID. This is what will be used to determine the selected rows and the product IDs. Line 18 has a class of prod_vendor. Line 18, prod_vendor. We're going to simply replace the text for that vendor name. And this is the code for the Update Vendors button. It looks for the item with the class of UPD vendors, which was that button. When it gets clicked, the first thing it does is it runs through and grabs all the checked rows. If there were none, if the length is not greater than 0, then it just produces an alert saying no product selected. If there are some checked, first thing it does is create an array, an empty array called prodlist, and then it loops through the checked items. And for each one of those, it grabs the value, which if you recall is the product ID, and then it pushes that product ID onto the prod list. So it's adding things to this array. Once that's done, it's going to render UPD vendors. Now this is _UPDVendors.html.erb. That's the modal. And it renders it into the product modal div that we had talked about before. After the modal is there in the product modal, it changes the prod list array to string, sticks it in the area with an ID of prod IDs, and then simply shows the modal. And this is the modal. It has a drop-down list that's going to list all the vendors, and then you just select one of those and click the Update Vendor button. This is a normal Bootstrap modal, all the required divs. You have the modal dialog, the modal content, and then the modal content has three parts: modal header, modal body, and modal footer. In our case, the modal body is the form that we're going to send to the controller once it's filled in. The form group on lines 9 to 12 is the vendor selection. It uses a Ruby form helper called collection select, and the parameters are these. First of all, you have the vendor, which is the group, params group, and then you have the ID, which is the individual param item. We'll see that later when we get a dump of the parameters as they're sent. Then you have the list, which came from the controller, of vendors. This is a list of vendors in alphabetical order, basically. Then the next two are how this information is going to be shown in the drop-down list. In other words, obviously the name is going to be the thing that shows, but when you click on one and pick it, what's going to be passed on is the ID. So the names will show, but the ID will be passed on. And finally, the last parameter is prompt true, which tells it to show the Please Select button rather than just simply showing the list of items. The other form group is the prod IDs. Now this is a hidden form group. We don't need to see it, but it will be sent to the controller, and this is the list of prod IDs. Remember, we converted that to a comma separated string, and it will be sent to the controller that way. In order to do this, I've set up an item in the routes RB file, and the basic reason for this is to be able to create a path called UPD vendors underscore path. Again, UPD vendors underscore path. And that will then go to, with a post, it will go to the controller products and the method of UPD vendors. Okay, the controller products, UPD vendors, the way this is set up, this allows you to use just UPD vendors underscore path. And the way it's used in the form is this: when you click the button, it's going to go use the UPD vendors path, which, as I said, goes to the controller products and the method of UPD vendors. It uses the method post, and then important for our meaning here is that it says remote true, which means it's going to use Ajax. And basically what that means is that when the controller is finished, it will go to updvendors.js.erb instead of the normal path, which is updvendors.html.erb. Now let's look at the controller. Once the button on the modal is clicked, the process goes to the controller, the method updvendors. Let's look at the parameters. The first one is the ID of the vendor, which is an embedded array within the parameter vendor. Then the other one is the prod IDs, which is a list of the products that are to be updated, and this is a comma separated string which we're going to convert back into an array. Okay, let's look at the UPD vendors. The first thing is it grabs the ID from the embedded array vendor from the params, and it sticks it in vendor ID. The next thing it does is it grabs the prod IDs and splits this string into an array and sticks it into the array prod IDs. Then it goes through each of the prod IDs, each one being called prod ID. The first step is to, of course, grab the product that you're looking for. So it uses the prod ID converted to an integer, sticks it in the variable product. Next step is to do an update attribute on that product. The attribute you're updating is vendor underscore ID, and what you're going to replace it with is the vendor ID that you pulled from the params. The update attribute is a nice Ruby on Rails function. It updates this one attribute and then does a save on the product. So once that's done, it grabs the vendor, finding it by the ID, using this vendor ID that came in, converts it to an integer, uses that to find the particular vendor, and then grabs the name. Sticks it in the instance attribute of vendor name, which will now send back to underscore updvendors.js.erb. That's where this is going to go to. And finally, we'll look at updvendors.js.erb. Once the controller is finished, because this is Ajax, where we kicked off when we said remote true, it will send the control back to updvendors.js.erb. This program grabs the new vendor name from the instance variable that was sent from the controller, and it sticks it in the JavaScript variable vendor name. Then it loops through all the checked rows, and for each checked row it does this process. First, from this, which is the checkbox, it navigates up to the TR, and then it navigates down to the TD with the class of prod vendor and changes the text of that prod vendor to the new vendor name. And then for each one of these, it then changes the property of the checkbox to checked false. So it does those two steps for each one of the rows that's checked, and once it's done changing all the vendor names and unchecking the boxes, it just hides the modal, and that's it. We're done.